On this episode of This Week in Linux, there's a lot of interesting beta software news from Linux Mint, MX Linux, Mageia, and Valve announced that the Steam Link is coming to the Raspberry Pi. We'll also check out some new releases from UBports Ubuntu Touch, WordPress, and more. Later in the show, Microsoft throws in the towel on their Edge browser, NVIDIA open sources their PhysX engine, and a lot of cool stuff in the Linux gaming section. Then we'll take a look at some security news from Kubernetes, Quora, and some unfortunate legal news regarding encryption from Australia. All that and much more coming up. I'm Michael Tennell with TuxDigital, and this is your weekly source for Linux GNUs. In case you missed the announcement last week, we're currently running a holiday sale for the Linux is Everywhere merch for the shirt, the hoodie, etc. For a 20% off coupon is the LINUXMAS coupon, LINUXMAS, and you can use it by going to tuxdigital.com/LinuxIsEverywhere, or if you're in Europe, you can go to tuxdigital.com/LinuxIsEverywhereEU for shipping inside of Europe. And remember when you check out to use the coupon code to save 20% off with the code LINUXMAS, LINUXMAS. Up first in the show this week is Ubuntu Touch Over-the-Air 6, or OTA 6. It's actually rolling out for 9 supported devices, including the Fairphone 2, the Nexus 5, the OnePlus One, and many more. It's more of an incremental update from the OTA 5 release that was about 2 months ago. So it's not like a huge, massive release, but they have done a lot of things for their new Morph web browser. It's received some updates for restoring the previous browser session, which is always nice. It supports web apps that access locally stored content, which improves a lot of functionality. And it also now supports reCAPTCHAs and has a new themable scroll bars and all kinds of different improvements to the tab browsing experience as well. So overall, that's great because the Morph browser is much better than the previous one, and it's really nice to see that they're making more improvements. There's also some specific hardware improvements for the OnePlus One, like better calling features and things like that. And they've also done some integration improvements for the Nextcloud system, or the Nextcloud integration system. Anyway, so this update is actually recommended by all, or for all users from the UBport team. So if you are using UBports, or if you're just curious about UBports, because I think Ubuntu Touch from UBports is probably the closest to functionally, like, ready to go, production ready. Like, it's not production ready, but it's super close, and it's probably the closest of all the other options. So if you are interested and you have a supported device, you should definitely check it out because I think it's worth trying. If you don't have one, you could go find like a Nexus 5 on Craigslist or eBay and things like that for fairly cheap because they are pretty old phones, and those are probably one of the better options for testing the Ubuntu Touch from UBports. But if you'd like to learn more about this particular release, you can find a link in the show notes. Up next in the show, Xubuntu has announced that they're ending the 32-bit ISOs, starting with Xubuntu 19.04. Xubuntu has announced that they're not going to support 32-bit because it's just too much of a burden on their team, because they're not a big enough team to maintain the infrastructure to create these ISOs. But they did have a vote to decide whether or not to do it, and they had a 6 of 10 voted to basically stop making the 32-bit. The actual 4 of the 10 that didn't vote for ending it actually didn't vote at all. So a lot of people were kind of confused that it was 6 versus 4, but it was actually 6 versus, well, no one, because the other 4 didn't vote. But if you wanted to use the 32-bit, you can still do that with the Xubuntu 1804 LTS. So that is still available if you do have 30-bit hardware. But at this point, it means that Lubuntu is the only flavor left of Ubuntu that was still going to support the 32-bit, because Ubuntu Studio is essentially like fairly closely connected to the Xubuntu, so that means they're not going to do it. But with actually Ubuntu Studio I'm pretty sure they removed it on the last version anyway, like the 1810, they got rid of it then too. So basically it means Lubuntu is the last one that currently has 32-bit. I'm not really sure if they're going to continue it or not. We'll see about that. But I think it's fair to say that if you are using 32-bit hardware, which is, by the way, super old, if you're using super old hardware, you probably don't care that much about, latest upgrades and latest updates and things like that. So the system of an 1804 would probably work anyway. So just a thought. Otherwise, there's a lot of different distros that still support 32-bit, including MX Linux, we're going to talk about later on in the show. So feel free to check out the show notes for this post from the mailing list for Xubuntu, and also we'll have a link in the show notes for MX Linux that will also, and I think pretty sure some more stuff we're going to talk about has 32-bit support as well. But anyway, if you'd like to learn more, you can find a link in the show notes. Up next in the show is Linux Mint 19.1 beta. This is actually one of the first betas things we're going to talk about, which is quite a few betas, multiple distros, as well as another interesting beta thing from Valve. So let's just get started. Linux Mint 19.1, or Tessa, as they released their beta for testing. This is the first point release of the 19.x series that is based on the Ubuntu 1804 LTS Bionic Beaver. With this one, there's a lot of updates, including a new design, but first we're going to talk about the fundamental, like the functional stuff that's new in this one. And that is first, Nemo has a lot of improvements for the performance. They've said that it's thanks to some code optimizations that's 3 times faster. And they've also said that they're adding the ability for to toggle thumbnails on and off per directory, which is pretty nice. So you can, they used to be where you had to, if you wanted thumbnails, it would apply to every directory, and now it can apply to just ones that you specify. So that's cool. They've also made some updates to the update manager, and making it easier to remove unused kernels and to check for the Linux kernel support status. So that's pretty cool. I like the updates for the newest version of the update manager because of the support for the different kernels. They're actually turning everything back on. They did that for the first 19 series, so I'm glad to see they're making it more improvements for that feature. They've also made some updates to the X apps, which are the apps that are forks from previous known applications. So, like for example, their editor is called Xed, and it's a fork of the older version of gedit. And the same thing for XReader, which is a fork of events, and I'm pretty sure it's a fork of events, and that's for PDFs and things like that. So they made a lot of updates for those. Now let's get to the really most obvious update, and definitely I think the best as far as like the design wise that they've pretty much ever done. Cinnamon has always been like this weird, to me it's been this weird design of like the panel system and the windows and the menus and things like that. They looked off because they'd have this really bright, kind of like a brush chrome effect on their windows, but then they have this nice gradient dark effect on their panel. So they still have that combination of light and dark, which is fine because that's actually really nice to, there's a benefit to that, having the bright windows for easier reading, and the dark panel for just so it's not abrupt and like in your way kind of thing. But they've made a lot of changes, so like the style has been modified to, instead of having the old traditional style, which kind of looked a little dated, they did have it for a very long time. This version has a more modern design with a kind of like a flat approach, so like a flat design approach. They have updated it so that the window list applets are now grouping windows by default. So like if you have multiple file manager windows, it will group it as one icon and then have like a number associated to it saying number 2, or how many managers or windows you have open. The thing that's interesting is like this is a new design, and I do like it in the sense of like their approach, but it does kind of feel like Windows 10-ish. I think that's kind of the point, really. But if you like that kind of thing, I think this is a good option for that, and it might be more enticing for people to try out Mint, because if they're Windows users, it does look fairly similar. So, that's nice for those people into me. And if you still like the old layout, you don't have to worry, it's not gone. They have a option where you can toggle it back to using the old version if you liked it with the Mint Welcome utility. And there's a bunch of other things that are coming with this release. Speaking of the Mint Welcome utility, there's also a new feature to have during the step of the install of the Welcome section, there's a new configuration step for the firewall, so that could be beneficial to some people. But overall, I think this has a lot of potential, and if you are a Mint fan, you definitely should check it out, especially since the upgrade from 19.0 to 19.1 will work, because it is not a rebasing of the core. Usually, if you have a Linux Mint has this issue where the iterative releases of the every 6 months, those don't have any update problems. They don't have upgrade problems because they're using the same core. They're just having like nicer things on top being fixed. But as from 18 to 19, there will be a problem, or was a problem, and 19 to 20 there will be a problem as well because of all the differences between Ubuntu and Mint as far as the core goes. There's not really a clean upgrade path between the big LTS switches. Between the 19.0 and the 19.1 and 2 and 3, those point releases they're just fine for upgrades. So feel free to try that out. And if you'd like to learn more, you can find a link in the show notes. Up next in the beta section, MX Linux 18 Beta 1 has been released for testing, of course, since it's a beta. If you're not aware, beta means that it's not really ready for production, not ready for every user. It's just for people who are willing to test things that might have breaks and bugs and things like that. So I didn't say that for the Mint, but that's also a beta. So the same thing applies to this one, to Mint and MX Linux and the next topic as well. So up on the news updates for MX Linux is that they've updated the firmware, they've updated the kernel to 4.19.5, they've updated Mesa to 18.2.6, and they've updated a lot of applications like Firefox, VLC, GIMP, LibreOffice, and things like that. But there's a lot of cool things that they're, like the MX tools that they make are really cool. So first, they've actually updated the system keyboard and system locale options to allow easy access to configure your system default keyboard and the language it uses on the system. But they've also done some really cool things with the MX package installer, making it having faster performance, adding Flatpak support. I mean, they've had Flatpak support for a little while, but this is like big improvements to the support for the Flatpaks. And they've also added some popular app entries. So like it's like a category where you can look for it's not really curated, but kind of is. So you can go there to find out like the most popular apps that they're offering you to download from. They've also done some cool things with the MX installer, which is like the system installer, and it now supports having an encrypted root, home, and swap partitions with the Lux encryption. I'm not sure if it's Lux or Lux. I never looked that up. I'm going to go with Lux because that just sounds fun. But anyway, the next thing, they also have updates to the MX codecs to install the updated S3 texture packs, which is pretty important for the Steam games and things like that. So if you want to use Steam in your MX Linux install, you should probably check those out. There are some known issues with this release. So if you are an NVIDIA user, the NVIDIA drivers in the main repo may not build against the new kernel yet. So the new drivers will be moved to the main repo when it gets closer to the release of the full version. So like the MX18 final release will have the NVIDIA stuff ready. So if you're using NVIDIA and you want to use proprietary drivers, that might not work. If you wanted to use the open source drivers, those are probably okay. But can't really guarantee that either, but probably. So just keep that in mind if you do want to try it out and you are an NVIDIA user. What's really cool about MX Linux as well, because of their MX apps or the MX course tools that they have, those tools are constantly being updated. It's kind of like their rolling release at the same time, but they're not as, the system itself is not a rolling release because it's based on Debian Stretch, but the apps are kind of a rolling release. So when they make big changes to their package installer and things like that, even if you're running an older version of MX Linux, you'll still get those updates. So that's a very cool approach. I like that. If you'd like to learn more about MX Linux or get a link to download the testing for the beta, keep in mind it is a beta. You can find a link in the show notes for MX Linux 18 Beta 1. Up next in the show is Mageia 7 Beta 1, another beta, like I said. And this one has a lot of updates to their core functionality. So the kernel is now being updated to 4.19.6. The Plasma version that they have is going to be updated to 5.14.2, which I'm fairly sure is the latest version, or pretty close to that. The GNOME stack will be updated to 3.30. XFCE to 4.13.4, which is like the development branch of it, which is pretty interesting. It's kind of similar to what Xubuntu's doing in preparation for the next version of 4.14. And they're also doing updates for various things like Firefox, Chromium, and LibreOffice and things like that. But what's really interesting is that they're adding some better support or enhancing the support for the AppStream metadata, giving a much richer experience for the software selection in the software search tools like the GNOME software and the Plasma Discover and things like that for both GNOME and Plasma. So that's pretty cool. They're also doing a lot of improvements to laptops if you utilize like Optimus, as well as their ARM ports updates. This is a fairly big update. There's not a huge, massive, major feature that's being brought into it, but it's a lot of core fundamental fixes and stuff like that, and improvements overall for performance and things. So it's more than just an incremental update, but there's not any huge flashy items or anything. But it's still a great update because I think Mageia is a fantastic RPM distro. So if you're interested in RPM, or if you're not pretty sure it means Red Hat Package Manager still. It might not, but I'm pretty sure. No, it means RPM Package Manager. Yeah, it's recursive. Okay, I remember that now. So if you were interested in trying out an RPM distro, Mageia is a good option for that. There's a lot of cool stuff in there, and the developers I've talked to are really cool. And really nice. So if you're interested in checking it out, Mageia 7 Beta 1. Now it is a beta, so keep in mind it'll probably be a couple months or so before the final release happens. But again, if you want to test it, feel free to do so. Mageia 7 Beta 1, there's a link in the show notes. WordPress 5.0 has been released. This is the latest major version from the WordPress project. And WordPress is, if you're not aware, a CMS for managing websites, or a content management system is what that CMS means. It is the most popular, by far, system for websites. It's probably about 30 to 35% of the whole internet at this point, because it is so massively adopted. It is good in many ways, also kind of not in other ways, but I'm not going to go into particulars because this is not a, content management system review show or whatever. But there is some interesting things that are happening with the latest version. For the most part, there's a lot of security improvements and performance improvements and things like that. But for the most part, those are underlying things, and their big focus on this particular release, or this push, I guess, is for the new editor, which has been named the Gutenberg editor. They also don't refer to it in the article or the blog post as the Gutenberg editor, but that was the name of it when you installed it. So maybe they changed the name. I'm not sure. But the Gutenberg editor is a block-based editing system. If you're not aware, this is a description that the WordPress blog gives for the Gutenberg editor. It says the new block-based editor won't change the way any of the content looks to your visitors. What it will do is let you insert any type of multimedia in a snap and rearrange to your heart's content. Each piece of content will be in its own block, a distinct wrapper for easy maneuvering. If you're more of an HTML and CSS sort of person, I am, then the blocks won't stand in your way. WordPress is here to simplify the process, not the outcome. Anyway, so a block editor is a very common editor in WordPress. There's actually many of them, multiple. I think of at least 6 or 7 that compete on the level. And now that WordPress is creating their own, it's kind of a negative to all of those plugins, because there's a lot of themes and systems that depend on these editors. And now that Gutenberg has been made by WordPress, it essentially makes those irrelevant and obsolete at some point, because they have the backing of WordPress, and they automatically get the backing of the community because they have the backing of WordPress. So most of those editors are probably going to go away. Most of them. Maybe not all of them, but most of them. Or they'll somehow make an integration system or compatible with Gutenberg. I'm not sure. Either way, block editing is nice because it makes it a lot easier to manipulate certain things on the system without having to edit any code and things like that. So there is that's a nice feature. So it is interesting to see what happens, but there is another problem that I really don't like, is when you want to edit the source code instead of using the blocks. It creates the source, it forces the source code in this really tiny box. And it's really annoying to read source code in a tiny, tiny box. So I do actually hate that part. Hopefully they will fix that in the future, but right now that part is very annoying. So thankfully, they do still have support for the classic editor for people who do like source code. And they said that the plugin will remain in WordPress for the classic editor until 2021. So and at least until they fix the source code issue in the new Gutenberg editor, I will still be able to use that, which I like. So there's that. If you'd like to learn more about the latest release from WordPress of WordPress 5.0, you'll find a link in the show notes. Up next in the show is some really interesting news. It's another beta from the Valve team for the Steam Link. So if you're not aware, the Steam Link is a piece of hardware that allows you to put it basically it's a set-top box, or was, that would you put it in your living room and you would connect it to your Wi-Fi, and via your LAN, your main desktop computer would play a game and then stream it to the Steam Link on your TV. So let's say, for example, you wanted to have like a party and a bunch of people wanted to play it, but they can't all sit at your computer. So you have the computer running the game and you have people playing it through the Steam Link on your TV. So that is a really cool concept. Unfortunately, it didn't really work out as far as the hardware goes for Valve. They actually started like fire selling the hardware they had. And I actually do have a Steam Link, the hardware version, and it works quite well. But they decided it's too much effort for them to make the product. They could do more of a software approach and make it easier on themselves. So this announcement is that they are now making a port for Steam Link to be utilized on a Raspberry Pi. So if you have a Raspberry Pi 3 or a 3B Plus, you can actually install Raspbian and then install the Steam Link software. And then once you can like launch the Steam Link and install the process, and then you can basically use a Raspberry Pi as a DIY Steam Link. So that's awesome. Like that's a really cool idea, because they decided to get rid of the hardware, which is, when they announced this, or they didn't really announce it, but they kind of did. But anyway, it's pretty cool that they basically, instead of like just discontinuing something and just letting it go away, they discontinued it and then provided a better solution for everyone, because a lot of people already have a Raspberry Pi 3 or a 3B Plus or whatever, and it allows them to just use that instead, which is really cool. So if you want to get it, you get Raspbian Stretch, and you can install the package. I'll have a link in the show notes to the forum post for the Steam Link, the steamcommunity.com website, and that will have all of the details of how to do it. You can see it in the screen right here, but if you're an audio listener, you'll have that in the show notes. But basically what happens is once you run the install the deb and you run the Steam Link command, it will download the full app, because that's how Steam or Valve does things. They create these little tiny packages, and then they install this bigger package from the actual script running inside of the smaller one. And then it will create a desktop application, or desktop shortcut, and then it will create like an automatic update system. So that's pretty cool. So it's kind of how they do the Steam regular client. But anyway, if you'd like to find out more, you can find a link in the show notes for the Steam Link beta for the Raspberry Pi. Up next in the show is NVIDIA has made an announcement that is actually surprising. They have decided to open source a very important piece of software. A decade ago, NVIDIA acquired the PhysX engine from their acquisition of Mageia, which actually originated from the Novadex. I think that's how you say it. I don't know. I'm not even sure if you say Mageia either. But they acquired this, and they decided to implement it inside of their GPU for accelerated physics in games. But turns out there's a lot more that this engine can do, and it's very helpful for scientific computing. And that's pretty much why it's going open source. They said in a quote from their announcement is, "We're doing this because physics simulation, long key to immersive games and entertainment, turns out to be more important than we ever thought. Physics simulation dovetails with artificial intelligence, robotics, and computer vision, self-driving vehicles, and high-performance computing." So there's a ton of different things that would benefit as far as like enterprise level, but also scientific level, that it would be really good for it to be open source, and they decided to do so, which is great It's very cool that NVIDIA is, they've open sourced things in the past, like they open sourced the Drive Studio, which then eventually became the Qt 3D Studio. But overall, it's very rare that they open source something that is actually like, a core element of their stuff. And it's also rare that they'll open source something that is something they still maintain and still actively develop. So for example, like the Drive Studio, that became Qt 3D Studio, but Qt makes that, not NVIDIA. This is the case. In this case, the PhysX or PhysX, this engine is actually something that they still maintain and still utilize. So that's really cool that they're doing that. So they open source it under the BSD license, and they've also included inside the license, they've included the GPU acceleration code. So that part is also open source. So anyway, it's very cool. If you'd like to find more about this topic, you can see a link in the show notes for the blog post from NVIDIA, as well as a couple articles from Phoronix and places like that I thought would be interesting if you wanted to learn more. So you'll find a link to those in the show notes. Up next in the show is some very interesting news coming from Microsoft. They have announced that they are going to end the development of the Edge HTML rendering engine and replace it with Blink, and therefore replace their Edge browser with a Chromium-based browser. Side note, Edge HTML is a bad name. It's very unfortunate. Should have been EdgeTML. That'd be... Anyway, Microsoft has a quote that is on their blog post from the announcement. It says that Microsoft has meaningfully increased participation in the open source software community, becoming one of the world's largest supporters of open source projects. Today, we're announcing that we intend to adopt the Chromium open source project in the development of Microsoft Edge. On the desktop, I ended it weird. To create better web compatibility for our customers and less fragmentation of the web for all web developers. That's a nice way of saying giving Google control over the internet. Anyway, Microsoft intends to contribute to upstream Chromium, and over the next year, will switch over to the Edge on Chromium base for their desktop builds. They actually don't use Edge HTML for their mobile versions. With the iOS Edge version, the browser that uses the WebKit engine, which is the default Safari engine, they just utilize it anyway. And with the Android version, they also use Blink there, so there's really nothing that's going to change for them there. They say that the first developer preview is expected in early 2019. They have no expectation of when the actual release will happen, but sometime in 2019 is expected. But for it'll be like the first quarter for the developer preview. So for developers, we'll get access to it for like a big beta testing thing. They also said, there's as I said earlier, that it kind of makes an issue of, they say that it's helping to eliminate fragmentation, but essentially that it's true. There's going to be less browsers that are competing. But that's not necessarily a good thing, because it means that all of the internet is dependent on Google at that point. Like if everything was based on Chromium, which a ton of stuff is, that's not really that good. Competition is important and options are important, right? So Mozilla actually had a blog post about this particular topic, and they said that by adopting Chromium, Microsoft hands over control of even more of the online life to Google. They say this may sound melodramatic, but it's not, because Microsoft's decision gives Google more ability to single-handedly decide what possibilities are available to each one of us on the web. This is a fair point, and I think that this is, it's very important that there is competition in basically everywhere, because when there's not competition, there's really no reason to improve. There's no reason to progress and innovate and things like that. It's always better to have competition. So I'm glad that Mozilla is still doing it, because that's very important. What's really interesting is the next statement in their blog post was, Google is so close to almost complete control of the infrastructure of our online lives that it may not be profitable to continue to fight this. So like as a business sense, they think that it might be a good business decision by Microsoft to stop fighting Google. However, they said, from a social and civic and individual empowerment perspective, ceding control of fundamental online infrastructure to a single company is terrible. And this is why Mozilla exists. We compete with Google not because it's a good business opportunity. We compete with Google because the health of the internet and online life depends on competition and choice. And I'd have to agree with that. Whether you like Firefox or whether you like Chrome or Chromium or Vivaldi or whatever, that doesn't really necessarily matter. Competition is always a good thing to have, and now there's less competition. I mean, I would have rather Edge have chosen to use the Gecko Quantum browser engine from Mozilla, but I understand why they chose Chromium, because it made it easier for them, because Chromium uses Blink. Blink is based on WebKit. It's a fork of WebKit, and they already use WebKit and Blink on their mobile apps, so it just makes it easier. So I understand that. Would have been nicer if they were to choose Firefox, but it is. I'm glad to see that they have recognized that Edge and that nobody wants Edge, nobody wants Internet Explorer. So it is nice to see that they have finally admitted that and are moving on. So that's good, and maybe they're going to help with, doing some more open sourcing of stuff. Fingers crossed, I guess. If you want to learn more about this topic, I have a link to the in the show notes for this blog post from Microsoft, as well as the blog post for Mozilla and some other stuff if you're interested in reading it. So check the link in the show notes. Up next on the show is the start of some fairly unfortunate or negative topics. There's a couple of these. We're going to end the show out with some good topics, some positive, upbeat topics. So there's that. But first, we're going to talk about the privilege escalation bug that was found in Kubernetes. It's a fairly critical bug, and it allows for privilege escalation from any user at all. So I'll go ahead and just to give the basics of it. It will allow any user to compromise a Kubernetes cluster by way of exploiting any aggregated API server that is deployed for it. So essentially, this is what happened. This is what the blog post or the announcement for the vulnerability describes it with. With a specially crafted request, users that are authorized to establish a connection through Kubernetes API server to a backend server can then send arbitrary requests over the same connection directly to that backend, authenticated with the Kubernetes API server's TLS, which is the TLS credentials, which is the security certificate, secure system, used to establish the backend connection. The problem is that it says any authorized user, any user that is authorized. The problem here is that by default configurations, all users, authenticated or unauthenticated, are allowed to perform discovery API calls, and that allows the escalation to happen. There's no simple way to detect whether this vulnerability has been used, but because the unauthorized requests are made over an established connection, and because that connection is now encrypted, is really hard to tell. They do not appear in the Kubernetes API server audit logs either, like the audit logs or the server log. The requests do appear in the kubelet or aggregated API server logs, but those are indistinguishable from correctly authorized and proxied requests via the API server. So it's very hard to tell if it has been utilized and you have been affected or not. So the thing is, this flaw is fairly big, and it actually affects all versions from version 1.0 to 1.12, but is only fixed in the supported versions of Kubernetes, which is 1.10.11. Well, basically it's 1.10, 1.11, and 1.12. Now, if you have any of those series, you need at least 1.10.11, 1.11.5, or 1.12.3 to have the fix. And if you are using Kubernetes in any kind of deployment, you should absolutely 100% update as soon as possible, because this is a fairly bad bug. Anyway, if you'd like to learn more about this particular issue or the CVE, you can find a link in the show notes for a couple blog posts about it, as well as the GitHub announcement from the Kubernetes project. Up next in the show is some, arguably horrible, infuriating news. And that is, Australia has essentially voted to implement encryption-busting laws, as in they want to destroy the entire purpose and existence for encryption. Yeah. So there's a law that's called the Assistance and Access Bill. They voted on it already, so I don't really know how many more things, if there's any more votes to happen, or whether it's going through or not. But they said that essentially the Labour Party has backed down from completely do it with its opposition, because the Labour Party from Australia was opposing the bill in many ways, and now they have essentially completely backed down in every way and abandoned their position. So they are probably going to pass this if they haven't already. They did vote for it and like massively favored for instituting this. I don't know if there's any other steps that they have to go through, but well, let's see what it is. Okay, so this is essentially it's a bill that wants them to create, allow the government of Australia to have a key, inside of an encryption. So they've made this bill has like three big branch systems for it. And so first off is the technical assistant notices, which is a compulsory notice forcing people. For a communication provider, essentially that's so obscure that could mean anything that provides any sort of communication at all, whether that's an ISP or like an app, like a chat app or something. So if they use any type of if they have interception capability and like create logs of the data, then they are required to give access to the Australian government if it is used in their borders, I guess. So that's bad. The technical capability notices, which are also compulsory notices for a communication provider to build a new interception capability so that it can meet the subsequent technical assistance notices. So basically what it means is that if an application or a service or whatever has the ability to keep logs of what's happening on their platform, then they're required to provide access to the government. If they don't have access and keep logs, they're required to create a method of keeping access and logs to give access to the government of Australia. So if you have an application that you use that doesn't keep logs and it's encrypted, so like end to end, for example, Signal, they're implying this bill is saying that Signal is now required to provide a key, and a key, which by the way I'm saying key with the quotes in the video version because there's really no such thing. When you put a key into encryption, you're breaking encryption, and therefore it's worthless. But anyway, the third one is the technical assistance request. Now, this one is interesting because this one is not compulsory. This is a voluntary request. And there's the article talks about how it says there is no criminal or civil penalty for not complying with this particular request, although this is covered by the same secrecy provisions of the previous things. So how does that work? They also say in the documents or the bill, the Director General of Security and the Attorney General can issue notices without judicial oversight. Now, to be more specific, Section 317V says the Attorney General cannot issue TCNs, which is the technical capability notices, which is the compulsory thing to force companies to add a way to break encryption, unless the Attorney General is satisfied that the requirements imposed by the notice are reasonable and proportionate. So essentially saying the Attorney General is not allowed to issue these requirements unless the person who is the one who's not allowed decides that it's okay. So there's no oversight. The person who issues them is also the person who decides whether it's okay to issue them. What? Okay. If a company does not comply with these new ridiculous, insane things, they can be fined $10 million, 10 million Australian dollars. But essentially, this is, a smaller app would be a smaller app like Signal that is specifically encrypted for the purpose of encryption. They're probably not going to do that, so I don't know what's going to happen there. But basically, this is a bill created by people who don't understand computers, don't understand encryption, don't understand the internet, don't understand technology. And that's why they're creating this horrible thing. I mean, I don't know if they do understand, if any of them understands it, but apparently based on the fact that they let this happen, most of them do not understand it. Because if they think that a hacker won't be targeting these backdoors that they're implementing and forcing to be implemented, they're completely naive and possibly idiotic, because that is a crazy concept of like saying like you create a backdoor and you make it publicly known because of the government forcing it to happen. To think that the hackers don't know too is ridiculous. Of course they know. Anyway, to make it even worse, the bill also says that there's a 10-year jail sentence for whistleblowers if things related to the bill are, provided in public information. So if there's something that the government utilizes this bill incorrectly or in a corrupted way, and you blow the whistle on it, you get jail for it. Built directly into the bill. So this does not sound good in any way whatsoever. Like every single piece of this is horrible, and the sad thing is that a lot of people might think that this, because Australia is doing this, that it's only affects Australia, but essentially, what's going to happen is either every app and every service that provides anything to Australia is going to leave Australia, or there's going to be a huge battle between all these apps and all these companies. Like, for example, Apple has specifically battled the U.S. government for this, like the same kind of thing, and you can guarantee they'll battle Australia. So this is going to just be a giant mess. And it is possible that they could hurt it if they were to get away with this. If they were to convince companies to create these encryption keys or backdoors, then they're hurting the concept of encryption, and they're hurting every other country that utilizes any of these apps or any of these services. So this is absolutely horrible. But it's hopefully they fail miserably and fall on their face, because that would be great. That'd be great. Anybody who is an Australian watching this episode and would like to inform me about the things that I got wrong, because I probably got something wrong, I would like to maybe do a follow-up. If there's some more information that you could add, please feel free to leave a comment below or send an email to the channel. That'd be great too. Anyway, hopefully this stuff doesn't really come to fruition, but at this moment it kind of feels like they're trying to do that. Moving on, less depressing topics. Less depressing. Still bad, but less depressing. Up next in the show, the Emby media server has now become proprietary. So, like I said, still negative, but not as depressing. The sad thing about this is that they were not open about it closing the source. They actually didn't tell anyone until they were asked about it. So they were asked, and they said, well, if you check out our recent announcement, we have additions now that are costing us money, and we cannot open source that. You could. Instead, because it's open source, there's ways to make money open source. There's tons of projects that prove that. Instead, we're modularizing and open sourcing as many standalone components as we possibly can. You can possibly do all of them, because it's your decision whether it's open or not. So that's ridiculous. But yeah, they're saying the core is not open, but the modular, like the plugins and add-ons and stuff, are. So anyway, they didn't make it clear at all how this worked. If you go to their post that they say the announcement's there, it basically just says hardware acceleration will now require Emby Premier, the premium version. But they don't say that the source code is now closed. They just say it needs a service, it needs a premium version, and you could they apparently don't understand how open source works or how stuff works. It's weird. Anyway. When clarification was requested, the developer who was responding to the previous comments has now decided to refuse to even respond anymore. And also eventually decided to close the thread entirely because they didn't want to talk about it. But one of the developers of the project did decide to provide his opinion with a disclaimer that says, the following is a private opinion, not an official statement. And then the statement then involves him laughing at comments of others, mocking people's opinions, and he even goes on to demonstrate that he does not understand what open source is about and how it works. Because he basically says that there's no way that open source would work over this, even though, of course, it would. It's very weird because Emby was one of those. Emby was also like constantly talked about being like an open source alternative to Plex, and it is no longer that. So that is unfortunate. And also the free version of Emby has been reported to be riddled with nagware. So that's not good. And on top of that, there's also reports in the thread that showed Emby had been violating the GPL for over a year now. So yeah, they don't care about open source, and even though there's some parts are still open as much as we possibly can, just use something else. Just do something else, anything else. Well, not anything, but whatever you want. There are a couple options to use if you're interested. There's this one called Streama. It's a self-hosted streaming media server similar to Emby, but actually open source, like legitimately, not in the sense of like weird, like Frankenstein monster way. Or you could use Plex if you want to, because if you're going to use Emby, basically people were talking about the only reason they used Emby is because it was an open source version of Plex, and even though Emby was incredibly buggy and broken in many ways, they liked the support the open source concept of it. So now that Emby is proprietary, there's no reason to use Emby, because if you're okay with proprietary, Plex is like 10 times better. It's much more reliable, it's more flexible, it has more features, it's way better. So the really only reason was because of the open source part, and they didn't get that. So we'll see what happens for them in the future. Probably not anything good, but we'll see. Overall, if you are interested in checking out a self-hosted streaming media server, check out Streama. I'll have a link to Streama, as well as this thread on GitHub in the show notes below. Up next in the show, there's another hack with Quora, or Quora? I think it's Quora. And they've announced that they had a hack of about 100 million accounts have been exposed for their details and information about their account. They're in their email when they announced to people, it says, "We are writing to let you know that we recently discovered that some user data has been compromised as a result of an unauthorized access to our systems by a malicious third party. The data breach includes account information like name, email address, encrypted passwords. They were hashed. They were hashed and salted for each user. So there should be enough way for the password not necessarily to be automatically. So it wasn't plain text, is what I'm saying. But it could be, depending on the hash system they used, it could be broken. There could be like a collision problem. They haven't really just explained exactly how they do it. But anyway, they have also things like data is imported from other networks that they were linked by the system. Also, any public content and actions that you made, like questions, answers, comments, upvotes, all that stuff is accessible. I mean, it's already kind of accessible, but it's more like it's all consolidated, sort of. And then also non-public content as well, such as answer requests that people have requested you to answer a question, the downvotes you make, direct messages you get. There's not a lot of Quora users that use the direct messages, though, so I guess that's okay. But, I mean, not okay, but I guess it's, a silver lining, sort of. It's not a very good thing. So if you are using Quora, you need to change your password immediately. If you're using the same password with Quora anywhere else, you should definitely just get a password manager and get a good, solid password. That way, this doesn't have to affect you as badly as it could in the future. But anyway, very important to change your password. But what's really funny is that in this post, this article that announced it, that was talking about it, there was a tweet from an employee at GitHub, which was Aaron Patterson, and his tweet said, "There's nothing like a data breach to remind you that you have a Quora account." Because a lot of people who have accounts on Quora apparently don't use Quora. So that's funny. Anyway, if you'd like to learn more about this hack, it's something you should, if you do use the site, definitely change your password and fix that stuff. But overall, You'll find a link to the show in the show notes to the blog post about this, as well as maybe the link to the tweet as well, because I enjoyed that. All that in the show notes. Up next in the show is some really exciting news from the Valve and the CSGO product. CSGO is Counter-Strike Global Offensive. If you're not aware, it's a game that is a first-person shooter, and it's typically like the most competitive first-person shooter basically ever made. And it is changing a lot of things. They're still doing all the things that are, it's always been, but they're adding extra modes and features that are very, very interesting. So, for example, the first thing they're doing is they're going free to play, or FTP, free to play. So you can play Counter-Strike Global Offensive now for free, and that's crazy. Like we'll get to that in a second anyway. But they also introduced the Danger Zone, which is the Battle Royale mode, very similar to like PUBG and Fortnite, for example. However, it's also incredibly unique. There's a lot of cool things that they built into it. Like they have a drone system, so you can call in for equipment with a drone, and you can use it to get new equipment. Like you can buy equipment that way. You can also shoot down a drone to make people waste their money and also not get the equipment they wanted. And you can also follow a drone to find where someone is to attack them, which is pretty interesting. I like that idea. They also added a hostage rescue system so that you can pick up a hostage, carry them to safety, and get extra money during the battle so that you can buy more equipment and stuff like that. So there's a lot of interesting, cool ideas that they've put into it. It's not like a normal Battle Royale mode. It's very unique. So that's very cool, and I do plan to try it out. There's also some interesting new things that they're doing with they had this Prime status thing, which was a way for to kind of like cut down on smurfing, because there's a lot of people who were like really good at the game that would make new accounts and then pretend to be bad and just destroy people. So they tried to work on that, and they did that by creating this Prime status system. And what's interesting is that they decided to turn it so that anyone who already owned the game is now automatically has Prime status. So even though I didn't play the game that much, I did own it already. So now I have Prime status. Okay. But even if you don't have Prime status automatically, you can still get it by either purchasing Prime status or earning it by getting XP and reaching rank 21 as a player. So this kind of probably is going to hurt their efforts to end the smurfing, because in theory, a smurf could just buy another account and become another account. I don't know why they're doing that. That's kind of weird. But the free-to-play thing is pretty cool, and it's probably a shot at the incredibly popular Fortnite game, which Epic Games makes. Because that's like a very similar type of game, but it's also very different. It's also a unique style. But it's interesting, and I think I'm definitely going to try it out this weekend, because I look forward to playing this, because I've not very good at first-person shooters in the sense of like the shooting part, but it does sound fun. So I'm going to try that. So anyway, if you'd like to find out more and you'd like to try this out, you have a link to the game on Steam as well as the article from Gaming on Linux in the show notes. Up next in the show is Epic Games. Speaking of Epic Games, has announced that they're doing a new game store. The new store is limited to Windows and Mac OS though, so that's unfortunate. But the reason I put it in here is because it has implications to Valve and their Steam store, as well as they did say that they will be supporting Android and other open platforms throughout 2019. That's presumably Linux being included, but that's just speculation at the moment, so we don't really know. But more than likely, they're talking about Linux, but we don't know for sure. If they are, that'd be great, because competition is good, but if the competition is limited, whatever. So Epic Game Store actually aims to give developers a much bigger chunk of the revenue for the Valve, than the Valve store, for example. Like Valve takes 30% or so, plus there's engine percentages and things like that. Whereas Epic is saying that they're going to take only 12% instead of the 30%. And also, if you use the Unreal Engine on the Epic Game Store, they won't charge you for the engine royalty fee, which is like 5%. So if you use Unreal Engine 4, you need to pay a 5% even on Steam, whereas on this, you just pay the 12 to Epic. So this is interesting because Epic is a really big company, and this has a lot of potential to go against Valve. But I still think Valve, I massively appreciate Valve because of how much they put into Linux and how like dedicated they are to the Linux platform. So I'm a big fan of Valve, and if Epic doesn't make a Linux version, I do hope Valve beats them because, I'm more loyal to Linux than I am to whatever game happens to be being made or whatever. So it's really weird because Epic's Unreal Engine is actually developed on Linux and it works on Linux, but some of their games don't. For example, Fortnite. Fortnite could totally work on Linux, but they have this, I think they use BattleEye. It's an anti-cheat system, and it doesn't work on Linux, so therefore they just don't care. So there's that. They're also saying they're going to support extra functionality for developers like being able to engage with players, content creation, integration with YouTube and Twitch, and other stuff. Okay. So if you support Linux, I will care. I'll pay attention to this to make sure, in a future episode, if they do actually support Linux, I'll let you know. Right now, this has potential to be negative towards Valve. So there is some, it could be negative. It's also very interesting. So if they do support Linux, that'd be fantastic. And I'm excited for competition in the space. But another thing is that Valve actually announced recently that they're going to adjust their revenue share. I don't know if it's directly because of this, but it was very similar in the time span. But their revenue shares change is only actually affecting people who have bigger titles who already have like a following and an audience. So that might not be that useful. So I don't know. We'll see what happens. If you'd like to learn more about the Epic Games Store, you can find a link to the article from the Epic's or Unreal website, as well as a link to the Gaming on Linux article if you'd like to as well. So check it out, the links in the show notes. Up next in the show, and finally, actually, is another gaming topic. The Humble Bundle, or the Humble Team 17 Bundle, is now out for available, and it's available for a little bit over a week now, week left. I'm sorry, and there's a lot of cool games that are coming on it. And if you have ever heard of The Escapist, that's a pretty fun escaping prison game. It's a pixelated platformer type game. It's pretty fun. If you haven't tried it, you should check that out. It's a part of the bundle, as well as the Panarium, Worms Clan Wars, Interplanetary, Overcooked, and Sheltered. Now, all of these games, also The Escapist has a bunch of DLC packs included in this too. If you haven't heard of it, Overcooked, all of these games are supported natively on Linux except for Overcooked. However, Overcooked is listed as a gold rating on the Steam Play for the Proton database, like protondb.com does list it as a gold rating, so it might be usable still. What's interesting is that Overcooked 2 is native on Linux. So it's just Overcooked 1 that's in the bundle, and it's not native on Linux. But still, it's an interesting set of games. If you're interested in trying it out, I'll have a link in the show notes. And also to let you know, the link in the show notes is an affiliate link that will give a small percentage of the sale to TuxDigital if you decide to purchase it. So if you do decide to purchase the Humble Bundle, I would appreciate using that link. But if you would like to know more, you can find a link to the Humble Team 17 bundle in the show notes. Thanks for watching this episode of This Week in Linux. If you like what I do here on this show, please like that smash button and be sure to subscribe. If you'd like to support the channel, we have multiple ways to contribute via PayPal, Patreon, and many more. You can learn more by going to tuxdigital.com/contribute. Or you can order the Linux is Everywhere t-shirt by going to tuxdigital.com/LinuxIsEverywhere. And remember the coupon code for 20% off, LINUXMAS, LINUXMAS. If you'd like to contribute to the show without any cost to you, you can use one of our affiliate links. You can find links for places like Amazon, private internet access, and many more by going to tuxdigital.com/affiliates. Or if you'd like to submit some GNUs to the show, then visit the subreddit by going to thisweekinlinux.reddit.com. If you'd like some more podcasting goodness from me, then check out the latest episode of Destination Linux, as I'm a co-host of that show. And just a reminder, the show is live usually every Saturday, so join us in the live chat room to discuss all the latest Linux news each week. Thanks again for watching. I'm Michael Tennell with TuxDigital, and as always, keep using, learning, and enjoying